I grew up believing that loyalty was the strongest bond a family could have. My father used to say that no matter what happened in the world, family would always stand together, and for most of my childhood I believed him without question. My name is Daniel Carter, and from the outside our family looked like something out of a magazine. A large house in a quiet neighborhood, a father who ran a successful company, a mother who hosted elegant dinners, and a younger brother who everyone adored. But growing up inside that house taught me something very different. My brother, Ryan, was the center of everything. Teachers praised him, relatives celebrated him, and my parents built their hopes around him like he was the future of the family name. I was the quiet one, the reliable one, the son who didn't cause trouble. When Ryan made mistakes, they were forgiven with a laugh. When I succeeded, it was expected. I spent years convincing myself that this was normal, that every family had a favorite and that it didn't matter as long as we stayed together. I helped Ryan with his homework when he skipped class, covered for him when he wrecked Dad's car at 17, and even worked part-time during college so my parents wouldn't have to worry about tuition for both of us. I thought that loyalty would eventually matter. I thought one day they would look at me and realize I had always been the one holding things together behind the scenes. But loyalty has a strange way of becoming invisible when people get used to it. After college I joined my father's company. It wasn't glamorous work at first. I started in operations, learning how shipments moved, how contracts were negotiated, and how employees kept the entire system running. I stayed late nights fixing mistakes others ignored, slowly building relationships with clients and managers who respected effort more than family connections. Over the years, the company began growing faster than anyone expected. New contracts appeared, partnerships expanded overseas, and profits doubled. My father loved to take credit for the success during industry events, but most of the people inside the company knew who was really keeping everything stable. They knew it was me. I didn't mind staying in the background because I believed the company was our family legacy. Meanwhile, Ryan drifted from job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to build a career. Eventually, my parents convinced my father to bring him into the business as well. He just needs guidance, Mom told me one evening over dinner. You're the responsible one. Help your brother find his place. I agreed because that's what I had always done. I spent months training Ryan, explaining contracts, introducing him to department heads, and quietly fixing the mistakes he made along the way. At first he seemed grateful, but over time something shifted. He began taking credit for projects I handled. In meetings he would present my ideas like they were his own, smiling confidently while executives nodded in approval. I noticed the change but stayed silent. I thought confronting him would only create tension, and family harmony still meant something to me back then. Everything changed the day my father called an unexpected board meeting. The room was filled with senior managers, investors, and our family seated at the front like we were royalty. My father stood proudly at the head of the table and cleared his throat before making the announcement that would alter everything. After careful consideration, he said, I've decided to name Ryan as the future CEO of Carter Industries. The room went quiet for a moment before polite applause began. I sat there frozen, trying to process what I had just heard. Ryan looked surprised but thrilled, shaking hands with executives who had worked with me for years. My father continued speaking about leadership, vision, and the importance of fresh energy in the company. Not once did he mention the person who had built half the systems that kept the business running. When the meeting ended, employees avoided eye contact as they left the room. A few managers gave me sympathetic nods, but no one said anything out loud. My mother hugged Ryan like he had just won an Olympic medal. This is exactly what the family needed, she said proudly. I walked out of that building feeling like the ground beneath my feet had disappeared. That evening I confronted my father privately in his office. I didn't shout or accuse him. I simply asked why. He leaned back in his chair and sighed like I was a child asking an obvious question. Ryan has the personality for leadership, he said. You're reliable, Daniel, but you don't inspire people the way he does. The words landed harder than any insult. Reliable. That was the label they had always given me, like I was a tool instead of a person. I built half this company, I said quietly. My father shrugged. And you'll continue helping it succeed. Think of yourself as the foundation. That was the moment I realized something painful. In their eyes, I was never meant to stand at the top. I was only supposed to hold the structure up while someone else took the spotlight. I left the office that night without arguing further. At home, my phone buzzed constantly with congratulatory messages meant for Ryan. Social media was already celebrating him as the young visionary who would lead Carter Industries into the future. I watched the posts quietly, noticing how my own name had completely disappeared from the narrative. The next few weeks were uncomfortable. Ryan began acting like the company already belonged to him. He replaced managers who disagreed with him, signed risky contracts, and spent more time attending networking parties than reviewing financial reports. I kept doing my work silently, correcting problems before they reached investors. Part of me hoped he would grow into the role, but another part of me began realizing something important. The company's success had never actually depended on my family's approval. It depended on competence. And competence was something I had spent years quietly building. One night after a particularly chaotic meeting, one of our biggest international clients asked me to step outside for a private conversation. "Daniel," he said, "everyone in this industry knows who actually runs the operations here." I didn't respond, but he continued, "If you ever decide to start something of your own, you won't be starting alone." That sentence stayed in my mind long after the meeting ended. For the first time in my life, I considered the possibility that loyalty didn't have to trap me in a place where I was invisible. Over the next few months, Ryan's leadership began creating serious problems. Profits dipped, key employees resigned, and several contracts were nearly lost because he ignored basic financial precautions. Each time my father asked me to quietly fix the situation so investors wouldn't panic. I did it because hundreds of employees depended on the company for their livelihoods. But something inside me had started changing. I wasn't fixing the problems out of loyalty to my family anymore. I was doing it because I respected the people who worked there. Eventually an opportunity arrived that I couldn't ignore. The same international client who had spoken to me months earlier invited me to dinner while he was visiting the city. During the conversation, he leaned forward and asked a simple question. "Why are you still working there?" I didn't have a good answer. He slid a folder across the table containing partnership proposals, investment offers, and the framework for launching a new company that would compete directly in the same industry. "You already know how to build the systems," he said calmly. "Imagine what you could do without anyone holding you back." That night I went home and sat in silence for hours thinking about everything that had happened. The favoritism, the dismissal, the years of effort that had been treated like background noise. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future that didn't revolve around proving my worth to people who had already decided my place. I opened my laptop and began drafting a business plan. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of freedom. Over the next 6 months, I worked quietly after hours building the foundation for a new company. Investors who respected my work joined the project almost immediately. Several former colleagues reached out privately, saying they would follow me anywhere if I decided to lead. The support was overwhelming, but I kept everything confidential. My family remained completely unaware of what I was preparing. They were too busy repairing the damage caused by Ryan's leadership to notice anything else. By the time my new company officially launched, we had already secured 3 international contracts and a full operations team ready to begin. The announcement went public on a Tuesday morning. Within hours, industry news sites were reporting that Daniel Carter, the former operations director of Carter Industries, had founded a new logistics firm backed by global investors. The headlines called it one of the most promising startups in the sector. My phone rang constantly that day, but the call that mattered most came from my father. His voice was tight with disbelief. "Daniel, what have you done?" I looked out the window of my new office at a skyline that suddenly felt full of possibility. "I finally stopped being the foundation," I said calmly, "and started building something that actually belongs to me." Our culture became something I had always wished existed in my father's company. People were recognized for their contributions, ideas were evaluated on merit instead of family status, and leadership meant responsibility rather than privilege. Watching that environment grow felt more satisfying than any title I had ever been denied. Then something happened that none of us could have predicted. One evening, a major business magazine published a long feature story about my journey from overlooked operations director to founder of one of the fastest-growing logistics startups in the industry. The article wasn't written like a revenge narrative. Instead, it focused on the years of invisible work that had quietly supported Carter Industries before I left. Former colleagues were interviewed, explaining how many systems inside the company had been designed or stabilized by me long before Ryan was promoted. By the time the article spread across social media, the public perception of our family story had completely flipped. Suddenly, I wasn't the quiet background figure anymore. I was the person many believed had been carrying the company all along. My phone exploded with interview requests and speaking invitations, but the message that surprised me most came from my mother. It was the first time she had contacted me directly since the day I left the company. "Can we talk?" she wrote. I hesitated before agreeing to meet her at a small cafe halfway between my office and the neighborhood where I grew up. When she arrived, she looked nervous, a sharp contrast to the confident woman who had once dismissed my contributions so easily. For several minutes she simply stirred her coffee without speaking. Finally she looked up. "I didn't realize how much you were doing," she admitted quietly. The words sounded simple, but they carried years of misunderstanding behind them. "You never asked," I replied gently. She sighed, her shoulders sinking slightly. "Ryan was always the one who needed attention," she said. "You seemed strong enough to handle things on your own." I thought about that sentence for a moment. It explained more than she probably realized. Strength had been mistaken for invisibility. Reliability had been treated like something that didn't need recognition. "Being strong doesn't mean someone doesn't deserve appreciation," I said softly. My mother nodded slowly, tears forming in her eyes. "I know that now." We sat there in silence for a while, surrounded by the quiet sounds of cups and conversation from other tables. Eventually she asked the question I had expected all along. "Will you ever come back to the family company?" I looked out the window, watching traffic move steadily through the afternoon streets. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel anger when thinking about that place. I just felt distance. "No," I said calmly. "But that doesn't mean I want it to fail." She seemed relieved to hear that, even though my answer wasn't what she had hoped for. A few months later, Carter Industries announced a major leadership restructuring. Ryan stepped down from the position he had barely managed to hold together, and an experienced external executive was hired to stabilize operations. The company survived, though it never regained the dominance it once had in the industry. My own firm continued expanding, not because of revenge or competition, but because we focused on building something sustainable. Years later, when journalists occasionally asked about the family drama behind my story, I always gave the same answer. Success isn't about proving people wrong, I would say. It's about finally building the life you should have had all along. Looking back now, I realize the most powerful moment in my journey wasn't the launch of my company or the headlines that followed. It was the quiet decision I made the night I stopped trying to earn approval from people who had already decided my place. The moment I chose to build something of my own instead of remaining the invisible foundation beneath someone else's success. And in the end, that decision changed not only my future but the entire story my family once believed about who I was supposed to be. The announcement of my new company spread through the industry faster than I expected, and by the end of that week the quiet stability I had built inside Carter Industries for years finally collapsed into chaos behind me. I didn't need to see it firsthand to know what was happening because messages started arriving from former colleagues almost immediately. Some were supportive, congratulating me on finally stepping out of the shadow everyone knew I had been standing in. Others were simply stunned, saying the office felt completely different without me there to quietly keep things moving. But the message that told me everything came from one of the senior logistics managers who had worked beside me for nearly 8 years. "Ryan signed another contract today," he wrote, "and nobody understands how we're supposed to fulfill it." I stared at the text for a long moment before setting my phone down. For years I had been the one solving those problems before they became disasters. Now, for the first time, they would have to face the consequences of ignoring the person who held everything together. Meanwhile, my own company began moving forward with a momentum that almost felt surreal. Investors were enthusiastic, Our operations team worked with a level of precision I had always hoped to build, and the clients who joined us did so because they trusted competence more than family names. Within a month, we secured a major international shipping contract that instantly placed our startup on the map. Industry blogs started referring to it as one of the most strategic new firms in the logistics sector. I didn't celebrate loudly or post anything dramatic online. I simply worked, building the systems the same way I had always done, quietly and carefully. The difference now was that every decision belonged to me and the team who believed in the vision we were creating. About 6 weeks after the launch, the first real shockwave hit my old company. A financial publication released an article questioning several risky deals Ryan had approved since becoming the future CEO. The article didn't mention me directly, but it did include an interesting line. Industry insiders suggest that Carter Industries may have underestimated the operational leadership of its former director, Daniel Carter. That sentence circulated everywhere. Suddenly people who had once overlooked my role were discussing it openly. Analysts began comparing our companies, pointing out that while Carter Industries struggled with delayed shipments and confused management decisions, my new firm was gaining contracts at an impressive rate. For the first time, the narrative that had always excluded me began rewriting itself in public. A few days later my father called again. His voice sounded different this time, less confident than the man who once told me I was only the foundation. "Daniel," he said carefully, "we should talk." I knew exactly what that meant. When powerful people realize they made a mistake, they often try to frame reconciliation as strategy instead of apology. I agreed to meet him anyway, partly out of curiosity and partly because some small part of me still wanted to understand how everything had unfolded so badly between us. We met at the same office building where I had spent nearly a decade working late nights to build systems no one ever credited me for. Walking into the conference room felt strange, like stepping into a memory I had already outgrown. My father sat at the table looking older than I remembered, his suit still perfectly tailored but his expression tired. For a moment neither of us spoke. Finally he cleared his throat. "You could have told us you were planning something like this," he said. I almost laughed at the irony. "You could have told me why you chose Ryan," I replied calmly. He looked down at the table for a long moment before speaking again. "The company needed someone charismatic," he said weakly. "Someone investors would feel excited about." I shook my head slowly. What the company needed was someone competent. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything we had said out loud. Eventually he admitted what everyone in the industry had already begun noticing. Ryan's leadership had created serious problems. Contracts were being mishandled, experienced managers were leaving, and investors were beginning to question the future of the business. "You know how to fix these things," my father said finally. "You always have." There it was, the same expectation that had defined my entire role in that family. I was supposed to quietly repair the damage while someone else enjoyed the title and recognition. Only this time the situation had changed. "I'm not part of Carter Industries anymore," I said calmly. "I built something else." My father leaned forward, desperation beginning to show through his carefully controlled tone. "You could come back," he suggested. "We could restructure leadership. Make you co-CEO with Ryan." The offer might have sounded generous to someone who didn't know the history behind it, but to me it felt like another version of the same old arrangement. I would do the work while my brother shared the spotlight. I stood up slowly, realizing that this conversation wasn't about repairing our relationship. It was about saving the company that had ignored me for years. "I hope you figure things out," I said before leaving the room. That conversation became a turning point in ways none of us expected. Over the next few months, the contrast between the two companies grew impossible to ignore. Carter Industries continued struggling with internal confusion while my firm expanded into new markets across Europe and Asia. The employees who joined us weren't drawn by flashy promises. They came because they had heard a simple reputation repeated again and again. Daniel Carter built systems that worked.